Okay. Can you mute? I don't know where the sound is. Oh. No. And this mic is working, right? I guess people should be able to hear me on the Zoom. I think 405. Yeah.
Microphone. This one. I can be very loud. We are very lucky to have with us today Dr. Naomi Saphra. She's doing, I think really some of the most interesting work on interpretability of neural networks from the perspective of the sort of dynamics of training and fine tuning, which I think is mostly what this talk is going to be about. Is currently a Kempner Fellow at Harvard, did a PhD at University of Edinburgh on sort of a lot of related themes. There was a bunch of other stuff in the biography that I didn't know at all. Plays roller derby, does stand-up comedy, teaches people to do code dictation. So take it away.
All right. Hello. Okay. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about interpreting the training process, and I'm going to just start out by assuming I don't want to argue with you that it's interesting to understand what's happening in neural networks or worthwhile. So let's just assume you want to understand NLP models. Okay, how do we normally do that? Usually people will do something like they'll do a behavioral test where they manipulate the input and look at how it changes things in the output, or they'll, do some kind of metric on the internals, look for a circuit, do some kind of intervention internally, any of these things. And they'll usually do it on a fully trained model, a single model. There's nothing beyond that. There is a single target of analysis, and it is one model at the end of training. So if you're thinking about what is a good explanation for something, well, what is a good interpretation, you might wonder, like, is this actually the right approach? And I'm going to just give you a little framing device that comes from a different science to think about what explanatory evidence should entail. The science is going to be ornithology. These are the eggs of the tawny-flanked prinia from a variety of individuals. They have many different patterns, colors. They're very individualized. You can see that. And for a long time, European scientists said, aha, we know what causes eggs to be flecked and spiraled and colored. It's camouflage. It has something to do with the visual system of predators. But this guy, Charles Swinnerton, had a proposal for an alternative explanation for what's going on. He said, okay, there is this bird called the cuckoo finch, which sort of gives away the ending, that comes in, lays an egg in the nest, flies off, and leaves this prinia stuck raising the chick. And in order for them to get rid of that egg, they need to be able to recognize their own eggs and differentiate them. So that's the proposal, right? But how do we actually know which of these explanations is correct? Again, we can't look at a single individual, which in this case is actually a species, at a single moment in time, because that's how we came to the conclusion that it must be something that we understand well, it must be camouflage. Instead, we have a few different lenses we can look through that give us more solid evidence. So one is the correlational lens. So you compare individuals that have a trait with individuals that don't. In this case, they find preferred hosts like the prinia have more unique eggs than non-preferred hosts. Then there's a developmental lens where you study the development of the trait over the course of time. And in this case, continents where there's a longer history of brood parasitism have more unique eggs. So Africa has nesting birds that have more unique eggs than European nesting birds. And then in the Americas, where we have no what are called obligate brood parasites, we have some opportunistic brood parasites, cowbirds. But anyway, now I'm going too far into the ornithology side. So let's just accept that continents with longer histories of this parasitic behavior have more unique eggs, the defense mechanism against it. And then the last lens we're going to be thinking about for today is the causal developmental lens, where we can say, I intervened during development, or somehow there was a natural intervention during development and the trait changed in a predictable way. And in this case, an invasive species of nesting bird that moves to an island that doesn't have brood parasites will lose the egg patterns. Okay. So now we know what some of the lenses we can use for defending an explanation are. So let's try actually understanding something now. And we're going to start with masked language models. Probably people are pretty familiar with this, but just as a recap, the task is that you are predicting a masked out missing word from a sentence. Lots of things we do with this for transfer learning. And this particular architecture, BERT, is made up of attention heads, and they compute an attention distribution that reweights the representations of each token in the sequence, right? And there is a phenomenon that's been observed in these networks that we're going to call syntactic attention structure, which was simultaneously discovered by multiple people in different ways, which is also very nice. And this observation is that if you give a particular syntactic relation, like subject, then there is going to be some BERT head that attends pretty consistently to the subject relation when trying to predict a verb. So that's going to look like this. The subject head has a higher weight on the subject of this masked out verb wears. This is a naturally emerging property. It's just something that people have noticed in fully trained single models. We're going to measure it with unlabeled attachment score, UAS. So every time you say see UAS in this presentation, think SAS. And so we know that this phenomenon exists. They have these specialized heads but are these actually important for grammatical understanding and so on and so forth? Well, there's some evidence. We have instance level observations, which is to say that these syntactic heads are pretty predictive of these syntactic dependencies, and that if you causally intervene by pruning out these heads, they hurt performance more than other heads. So the problem is with the instance level observation is that they don't really tell us, is this a necessary artifact or is it just a side effect of training that has somehow emerged as a result of something else? In evolutionary biology, these kinds of effects are called spandrels. But then we say, okay, well, there's causal evidence, right? But what if the causal evidence is compromised by something that isn't just about that this head is necessary for a particular skill, but instead that these heads are just more entangled with the rest of the model due to some kind of developmental effect. And therefore, pruning these heads out is just like going to have a bigger effect on literally everything because they're just entangled more with everything else. Okay, so let's look for evidence for this, the importance of this syntactic attention structure a little more then. Okay, this is work with my collaborators over at NYU. It's led by Angelica Chen. And we're going to start with that correlational lens, right? So one way to do correlations is across random seeds. So if we take 25 random seeds that are independent BERT runs, we can say, okay, is syntactic attention structure correlated with grammatical capabilities as sort of represented by the BLIMP score, which is like a grammatical challenge set. Well, I like to put plots in my papers occasionally that show no correlation. So I can say, look, that doesn't look like a correlation. And this is definitely one of those. Okay, everyone accepts that they would never put this in a paper to say, look, I found a correlation. So then does that mean that this is a red herring for grammatical capabilities? Is SAS just, you know, are we ready to throw it out? Okay, yeah.
If you want questions directly.
So I have a little question bit after every 3 times. So I'll have 3 times for questions. Okay, so we're going to look at the developmental lens now. And actually, from this point forward, it's not enough for us to look at the trained models. Developmental and causal developmental lens means that we need to think about training, right? Okay, so when does SAS emerge is the first question we're going to ask. It's acquired very abruptly. You can see there's it comes out of nowhere, 25,000 time steps into this, and then it plateaus very abruptly. It also accompanies a very large drop in loss, so that's sort of promising, isn't it? And it's followed by gains in grammatical reasoning on specific grammatically challenging examples. So we could say SAS precipitates grammatical capabilities, but does this actually mean that grammatical capabilities actually depend on SAS? Well, to answer this question, we're going to try suppressing this behavior. And this brings us to that causal developmental lens, like the invasive species on the little islands. Okay, so the way we're going to suppress SAS is by taking the distribution produced by the subject head and penalizing that distribution during training with like a little regularizer that's just penalizing actual attention to the subject. And so this is just going to be on the maximum weight placed by any head. So what we're actually penalizing is the specialization. The regularizer looks like this. So you can see that it's penalizing the maximum, which means that we are not saying don't attend to syntactic neighbors. We are saying you can't have a specialized head that attends to this syntactic neighbor really strongly. Okay, so the impact of SAS then is at the beginning of training, you know, all these cool colors are with the it says SHS here, it's fine. SAS is suppressed in all of these cool colors, right? And it is left alone in all the warm colors. And you can see there's like not that, I mean, okay, there's some difference in the SAS score, UAS. That's okay. That's what we would expect, right? We're suppressing that pretty directly, but the loss is not that changed. But here's something interesting. The suppressed case actually has better performance at small scales, and it doesn't start losing to the baseline until after SAS hits. Yeah? Okay, so that's interesting. I think that we have some evidence for the importance of this phenomenon now, because we have our developmental lens, which is that transitioning into this strategy precipitates some grammatical capabilities just visually, and also that suppressing it damages grammatical capabilities. But going back to that, why did we see two phase transitions? Like we saw an earlier phase transition when you suppress SAS, yeah? So there was the onset of the strategy that's the baseline strategy, and then there's some kind of competing strategy that emerges when you suppress it. So we can think of this like we're avoiding SAS and discovering a new competing strategy as a result. And one question we might have is, well, can we get out of that strategy? Is it sort of escapable and we can rediscover the SAS phase transition? Okay, to answer this one, which is sort of an interesting question, but we'll go a little further and you'll see why we care. We are going to regularize at the very beginning of training so that we avoid SAS, we avoid that phase transition, and then we're going to stop suppressing it and let it learn to specialize its heads in syntax. The longer, first off, that we suppress SAS, the less it recovers, like long term, which makes sense. And specifically, if we suppress beyond that competing strategy, then we really can't recover it very quickly. So you can see that competing strategy, once you hit the competing strategy, you cannot then like just, you know, quickly get SAS. It's sort of like, well, let's say actually more than that, that if you go past the competing strategy, then you lose that phase transition entirely. This is the magnitude of the jump in SAS after the, like, you know, at the point that has the biggest jump, really. And you can see that you never hit that jump when you suppress beyond the acquisition of that competing strategy. So then it can't jump back into SAS. At least it can't do this sort of phase transition or break. If we continue looking at long-term training, it never sort of rediscovers SAS in the same structure as before, but it does actually reacquire grammatical capabilities. It relearns those. So it actually seem to recover an alternative grammatical strategy if we continue past SAS. If we continue past that competing strategy. And in fact, interestingly, if we are just briefly suppressing, we're even improving the loss over the baseline. So that's kind of neat. It's like we avoid SAS, we find our competing strategy, and then we discover something entirely new that's better. Okay, so now is a good time for questions. Little recap of what I just talked about, but any questions? Yeah.
What is the alternative strategy?
Look, this is I guess like how the sausage is made thing is that we spent a very long time on this paper because we kept on trying to figure out the exact sort of alternative strategy. It does seem like it has something to do with like long distance dependencies with, you know, like just a slower acquisition of like first longer distance engrams and then gradually shorter. But the real answer is we're not like 100% confident, and it's probably worth following up more on that, but we eventually wanted to publish this paper that had appendices up to O already. Yeah, anyway.
And how it will measure specifically like, oh, whatnot.
I think that is probably it's probably answered by Karen Clark and Lena Voita's original papers on this phenomenon, but I don't actually know for sure for ours. Yeah, we use like one of Clark's definitions. So yeah. Yeah. Are you talking about the loss or on the grammatical challenge set? Yeah, it's not like perfectly up there, but it's very close, and the loss is pretty much recovered at that point. Like the loss is better, the grammatical like capabilities are not that much worse. And in both cases, both grammatical, like both the specialized grammatical capability or like the specific grammatical capabilities and the overall loss are improved like for, you know, mid-ranges of training by briefly suppressing and then letting it go. So in both of those cases, you do see an improvement over the baseline, in fact. Yeah. Okay. So now coming back to this correlation plot we saw, why didn't it seem important when we looked at correlation? Maybe we're not getting the right kind of variation when we look at just random seeds. And that leads to another question, which is when does the seed have an impact on the performance of the model? Okay, so this is some other work that I was involved with where we just looked at 25 different bird seeds and said, okay, actually it turns out that like gender bias, for instance, has a very wide range of effects, and also certain interventions, that there's a lot of things that have very wide variation across random seeds. So that's one thing. They have different OOD generalization as well, which we're about to get into. So everybody sort of knows generally out of distribution generalization, you start out by training on your train set, and then there's some kind of big distribution shift. So let's talk a little more about this and what I mean and what the evidence is for that, right? So we're going to start out, and this is work that was led by Jivesh Juneja, who's the first photo there, and my other collaborators. So, okay, we're going to start out by considering specifically natural language inference. This is a classification task. There's 3 possible values. It's either these things contradict each other, or they entail, or ambiguous. So in this case, for instance, the actor paid the judge is something you can infer from the judge was paid by the actor. Yes. But if the actor was paid by the judge instead, we can no longer infer that the actor paid the judge. Contradiction. Okay, so in distribution accuracy is actually very consistent, as you might expect from everyone's sort of just assumptions of how training works. They're all around like 85% accuracy. But what about distribution shift? And specifically, we're going to think about distribution shifts that violate the heuristics the model might learn for what implies inference, when it can infer inference. Okay, so there's this challenge set Hans for NLI. And we're going to look at like 2 of the heuristics that they have as challenge sets. So one of these heuristics is lexical overlap. You're assuming that the words in the hypothesis that match the words in the premise, like if that's the case, then it must be the case that these are that you can infer the hypothesis from the premise. This is an example of when that's not true. So this would be something that you could see in a challenge set. the judge was paid by the actor does not imply that the judge paid the actor. And then a constituent-based heuristic is basically if this hypothesis is a constituent in the premise, then we assume that it's something we can infer. And this is also not always true. I didn't see if the actor paid the judge does not imply that the actor paid the judge. All right, so now we can say that these heuristics, violations of these heuristics in the form of a challenge set, show huge variation across random seeds in terms of like models' abilities to generalize, right? So there's a pretty wide range of performance on Hahn's constituent, the constituent violation set, and then a very wide range on Hahn's LO, which is the challenge set for lexical overlap. Okay, so we're seeing pretty wide ranges. So like generalization out of distribution isn't just about, you know, how long have you trained the model, how big is the model? There's also a random factor. So how do these random factors actually determine generalization behavior? And we're going to start specifically with that lexical overlap heuristic and challenge set. All right, so, you know, I'm just going to, I know that everybody is probably comfortable with this distribution shift idea, but let's say that you're training on your nice loss surface, you found a great parameter setting, and then there was a distribution shift and it's terrible now, right? So we're considering the response of the loss to the parameter weight, and the first thing that people think of when they're thinking about these loss surfaces and like the response to movement in the weight space is, okay, if you move a bunch in the weight space and there isn't that much of a change in the loss, which is to say you're in a flatter minimum, then you have good generalization. If a tiny perturbation in the weight space creates a huge increase in loss, then you're at a really sharp minimum, and therefore we think generalization bad. Okay, that's not a great way to think about this particular type of generalization, at least. Models that are in flatter regions as measured by local sharpness are not better at generalizing to this kind of challenge set. Okay, this is another plot that I like to put in and say that's not correlated. So then what is? Okay, we're going to move out of this local sharpness idea and look at large scale properties of the entire loss surface or of longer distances on the loss surface. And specifically, we're going to think about interpolation between points that are far away on the loss surface. So interpolation, you know, you start out with weights from model A, weights from model B, and you're taking a weighted average. You're just moving back and forth between model A and model B. And there is a general observation that this actually improves the loss, that as you interpolate between your two models that are trained from different random seeds, and that the loss actually goes down as you interpolate between them. And this is like handy. People love this. This is the premise for things like model soups, or Leshem has done work that uses this. Yeah. So is this a fundamental bias of training? Every random seed will always lead to something that is linearly connected to every other random seeds model. These papers all said yes. These papers are like, we found some really interesting linear connectivity effects. We used some really nice connectivity effects. Those are all from image classification. Out of all of these, Model Soups is the only one that looks at text classification as a test bed, and it doesn't work. Or it really doesn't work consistently, at least. Okay. So then let's look at whether it works in our text classification example. Well, if you take some of these really good generalizing models out of the 100 models that we look at, right? We look at 100 fine-tuned models with different random seeds, and we take the top 5 generalizers, the ones that are least susceptible to this kind of lexical overlap heuristic, or least reliant on it, right? Then you interpolate between them. It looks pretty connected to me. I'm happy with that. Sure, linear connectivity hypothesis, totally correct. And actually, it looks pretty good when we connect a model that's really dependent on the lexical overlap heuristic to another one that's really dependent, which is, say, 2 models that are bad at generalizing to the challenge set. That looks pretty good. Okay, let's just connect one that's from the good generalizers to the bad generalizers. That does not look so good to me. This is not particularly connected. All right. So it turns out that the linear connectivity hypothesis is not, in this case, true. And they occupy separate basins. Different models can occupy separate basins in the sense that they can be connected to different models. And they have different strategies, potentially. But these basins are still high enough volume that you will be able to find it with a standard optimizer, the same optimizer. So sharpness isn't actually that great for differentiating between them. They're both pretty high volume basins. Okay. Whoops. So then let's start really measuring connectivity to dig a little deeper into this. Okay, a standard way of measuring this linear connectivity is the height of the barrier, in the sense that, like, whether the maximum value of loss when interpolating between them, how far is it above your original models, model A and model B, at the endpoints. So we are going to tweak that a little bit to get at the general sort of non-convexity of this interpolation surface. So we're going to just find the point where there is the largest barrier on any line segment as you interpolate between these models, right? So we're going to call that the convexity gap. And if you use the convexity gap as a sort of dissimilarity metric between pairs of models, then you can see something. So here, these colors correspond to the convexity gap, which means a brighter color is sort of further apart, or is less connected, let's say, less connected to the other model that you're looking at. And these are, for every pair of models out of 100 models, and this ribbon shows up. And the important thing to understand what this ribbon is showing us is that these models have been sorted according to how good they are at generalizing to the lexical overlap challenge set, right? So you can see that these are kind of 2 connected components. There's one basin where everything is connected to, there's like your big basin where everyone is connected to the big basin good generalizers. And then there's the little basin where everything is connected to the bad generalizers in the little basin, right? So, and we can even see this if we just say, okay, well, we're going to look at the clusters that are formed by this sort of non-convexity as a similarity metric. Then you can see that those clusters also can be used to figure out the heuristic. So this is something I am much more comfortable saying that's a correlation, right? Okay, that's a correlation. What heuristic is in that other basin, though? We saw that this one is that the little one is using lexical overlap as its heuristic. What about the other one? Remember that I pointed to 2 of these heuristics, the other one being a constituent-based heuristic, which is to say this is syntax aware. The other one was an unordered sort of bag of words treatment. This one is aware of syntax. And it does turn out that the better you are at dealing with challenges to the syntactic heuristic, the more likely you are to be in that little basin. Okay. So, more like you are to be in the big basin. Sorry. You know what I mean. Here we go. So we have two distinct clusters. They have very different distributions. You can see they have even different distributions in distributions when you really zoom in on it. And then you might ask, okay, but you just showed one task. Is this just NLI? Okay. How about paraphrase? Paraphrase is kind of different from natural language inference. And if you look at an out of distribution data set that's just formed by reordering of words and seeing like and so that it's either invalidating or not the paraphrase, then these models are going to vary pretty widely on that. And it is associated with the same kind of ribbon and the same kind of connected components that we saw in NLI. And in fact, if you want a really different task, then linguistic acceptability is also one where we see this kind of effect, although really rare to have an outlier. But the outlier that we see that's responsible for most of the disconnections in the model similarity graph here, this weird little outlier at the very end, is also the best at generalizing to the out of distribution data set there. And in order for that to work, it would need to sort of learn the general concept that things that are unlikely to happen in English are not acceptable. Okay. So we saw that there's multiple loss basins and that the optimizer can find both of them in these settings. But how is it finding both of them? How do they actually affect the training trajectories? So let's assume that we have our two basins, one of which has your bag of words model and the entire space of like these lexical overlap heuristic models, and somewhere in it, the best possible lexical overlap model. And then on the other side, the best possible constituent-based model. Maybe some of these runs are slower. Maybe they all pass through the bag of words heuristic, and sometimes we just catch them in the act. Sure. What if instead they're just trapping the training trajectories? You just start out in a place where you have access to one or the other. What we saw is that both can happen. Generally, these basins trap training trajectories. So what's going on here is that all of these gray arrows are model runs that throughout time are getting more and more close to the centroid of their cluster in that spectral space that's defined by the convexity gap, right? But the pink arrows are showing ones that are jumping out of the lexical overlap basin and into our like syntax aware basin. So it happens. Okay, so then an actual model might look more like trapping and then occasionally transitioning. Sure. And from there, I'll take more questions. Yeah.
Okay, so this is for fine tuning like the head.
This is fine tuning the whole model, but there's a random initialization of the classifier head at the linear classifier.
It's whole model.
Yes, yes. It doesn't obviously it does not work like this if you're just doing the linear head, because then you're solving a linear, you know, it's convex. Yes.
So we're minimizing data order also with the random theory.
Yes, but the data order doesn't seem to matter actually. We do happen to be randomizing data order here, but it's the random seed, it's the initialization seed that's important.
And so when you're defining you're training these models on some type of evaluating capacity. You're defining their generalized, you're evaluating the different types of what you're training on, and you're evaluating their ability to merge the model by how well they do on the second level, correct?
Okay, so the second task is a challenge set that's just difficult examples of the, yes.
Their ability to merge well based on the performance on.
No.
Okay.
We actually we're looking for, okay, so let me see. So the convexity gap is measured on the in distribution, as in task A surface. Yes, because otherwise, like, you're actually looking at like what you're actually looking at is not like this.
Yeah.
It's like this, and that's a much less, I wouldn't describe that as like something where you can get interesting information about convexity as much.
In task A training allows them
Yes.
to guess the
What the performance on task B will be. Yes,
Okay, thanks.
yes. Wait, maybe, you first since you, yeah. Are you talking about like simulated annealing? So I mean, I think there are definitely ways of ensuring that you consistently get to a specific basin. Simulated annealing might be one. Another is actually much simpler. It's like when you fine tune the linear classifier head and then the rest of the model, because then you're doing a convex optimization problem before you move on from there, right? So there's definitely ways of turning this back into a single basin surface. Nothing artificial, no. Yeah. Oh, wait, Jacob, you wanna?
Yeah, I mean, it's just
Yeah.
related to that last one you were saying,
Yeah.
given that all of this variability is driven by this like single vector that corresponds to the, I guess, three vectors that correspond to the application head. Can you pick which basin you're gonna wind up in by, you know, is it the sort of thing where you could like stare at the parameter of the model or design a OOD test set or something and like.
Yeah, so
Put the model in one of those basins.
this isn't in the paper, but we do find that like that the initial Euclidean distance of the initialization from the other initializations that go towards a particular place determines not the, what it determines, I'm not going to say that it determines like the wholesale what basin you end up in, but that if you're closer to the like big basin and you happen to end up in the small basin, then you're more likely to make that transition into the big basin after.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking more like, can you find the sentences whose representation are closest to the.
I don't know, I think initialization is a, yeah, I would say initialization is a hard problem that people don't do enough work on, but we don't know, yeah. Did you have a question?
Basically the same question, but small add-on is like, can you do the Euclidean distance in the final converged ways? Like, can you see the one in the same basin are literally close to each other?
Yes, Euclidean distance definitely is like more sort of neatly correlated in these settings with the phenomena we're interested in. But I think the reason we are interested in this convexity gap and not just looking directly at the Euclidean distances is because it does, I think, demonstrate something about why there is clustering in the Euclidean space. Yeah. So the Euclidean space is actually more directly mapping onto these functional differences, but I would say that looking at the convexity of the loss surface is informative about how you end up there. Yeah.
About like practical applications of like, for example, like generalization maybe involved on, or like, you know, how generalization application works, whether they already have that translation. Like doing that. Like, is that some kind of
I think that I've spent a little bit of thought on this, although I'm not a person who makes anything better, but it's, I would say, indicates there might be approaches around like we have weight ensembling, we have voting ensembles, and maybe there are situations where there's incompatibility in the weight space, but that you can still use voting ensembles. So it might be a way of like doing multiple ensembling techniques in conjunction, stuff like this. Okay, so now we've seen these random factors are not only shaping how we generalize, the last thing we saw, they're potentially shaping when we generalize, bringing me to, oh no, I need a okay. All right, bringing me to another paper, which is how does this randomness actually affect training? Is there a, I'll just take a pause to figure this out. Okay, thanks. All right. Okay, so the training process has its own random variation. And this is work with my collaborators at NYU, led by Michael Hu, and also Angelica Chen is on it again. All right. So a visualization of training variation. That's what we're going to be showing you. All right. So this is a little technique we developed where you first just take these little summary statistics from the model weights. Simple things don't require any kind of running the model, no backprop, no inference, nothing, just looking at the weights, taking the L2 norm, like sparsity metrics, etc. So we are extracting that from the model weights and then fitting a hidden Markov model onto those metrics. With the idea being that a particular state in the model is going to be affecting those static metrics in particular ways, and we can map that back onto the loss, right? And then we can say it's in this state over here, it's in this state over here. So one example is if you look at a few different runs of BERT, then you can see that while the loss is pretty consistent, there are certain metrics. In this case, this is like the weight average that change very differently during training. And we're gonna just talk about something that's a little more sort of significant that does affect the loss, right? Which is generalization, right? So if you don't know about grokking, everyone was super excited about grokking like a year ago. It's when you generalize very suddenly after you've already overfit to your training data. So these are, training data over here, like the accuracy is in red, and then the validation is in green. You can see that like you've been overfitting for a very long time before you start generalizing, which is something that classic learning theory didn't think should happen, but that now people have a lot of theories around. It happens in a lot of toy tasks, especially. And we're going to be doing the classic grokking task, which is modular arithmetic. And something that people don't talk about that often is that generalization is the time of generalization, including in these classic grokking setups, is going to vary very strongly from one seed to another. So some of those seeds we see in our set of like 50 random seeds generalize right away. There is no grokking, right? Others, the majority, because this is the classic grokking setup, show the classic grokking behavior, where they generalize after overfitting. And then some of them take a really long time to generalize, way after overfitting happens. And you can see that the HMM has learned that some of these, like that there are these detour states. Everything eventually ends up in that generalization state, number 3. But in the meantime, you might go through any number of states. And the more states you go through, the longer it takes you. So it seems that in this case, some training runs really are just slower than others, right? So we've found a case of the slow run, right? Okay. So talking about generalization, what can we actually get out of these state models? One thing is that everything is all about L2 and the rate at which it declines. So if your edge transition is going straight into the fast generalizer, then your L2 norm is declining at just the right rate. If it goes too slow, then you end up going through a detour state. And if it goes too fast, then you go through multiple detour states and it takes you forever. So that means that like these are that this L2 norm like movement is all about getting access to this Goldilocks zone where you're going at the right rate as you learn. And if you want to avoid something like that, you actually just need some standard regularizers. So if we think about this as like the classic grokking setup, which has this very like wild, unstable kind of state machine where you can go through multiple detour states on your way out, and you compare that to how a ResNet trained on CFAR acts, which is a very tidy, predictable line from one state to the next, you can say, well, this is unstable, and that is actually why grokking happens in that scenario and not the other one. And in fact, if you do add just a few like regularizers, you change the batch size, you get stability, and grokking never happens again. And likewise, if you take that really like nice stable ResNet, you're like, yeah, image classification, it's a great test. No, what happens is that we've spent a lot of time figuring out how to optimize a ResNet for CFAR. And so if you take away some of those things, if you change the batch norm, if you remove the batch norm, you remove the residual connections, you have instability and it takes much longer to generalize. So let's, so this is another pause for questions right now. Yeah?
Like, why do we plot like we said, you know, zero instead of zooming in that zero? Because like something is changing, right? So the model changes for record, maybe it's not zero, or that is well not zero, but everyone plots that, you know, as zero. So maybe you zoom in like there's some transition there.
So there is work on progress measures because sometimes actually you don't see the loss changing at all, really, like not the generalization loss on certain tasks. There's certain like parity and stuff. You don't really see the loss changing at the output level, but you do see that certain like neurons start overtaking other ones. Like if you look internally, you can measure the progress that is being made towards, you know, grokking. And this is also true of other like emergent phenomena that people think about. Like if the classic sort of big bench example is checkmate in one. And it turns out if you look at its capabilities of just producing a valid chess move, then that changes very smoothly. And then checkmate in one pops out as soon as you're really, really consistent at producing valid chess moves. Yeah. Did we look at the loss? I mean, this is the training loss.
But this is what I'm saying, so just like it's not zooming yet.
Oh, so you're saying that maybe the loss is getting better on training?
Yeah, like maybe there's not changing involved. Like kind of there's not changing involved. Spikes, but they're very small.
I mean,
loss is not pure.
Sure.
Gradient and the whole thing.
Well,
You say gradient,
sure,
it's
yeah.
not changing. Right.
Sure.
Okay, so there's gradient, there's loss.
I'm not actually, you know what? You'd have to actually look because I'm not sure if it is the case that like, This is like a very, like it's a very strong overfitting. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's what I thought.
Oh,
So it's those terms that are like, typing up a rather than that, creating that.
Right, yeah, grokking doesn't happen with weight decay. You just overfit and it never ends, yeah. So,
Yeah, okay.
eh?
Question about the, like, for measuring, what grokking not happening, how do we define grokking not happening?
So there's the way that, so in that case, we mean that there's no point where you are overfitting but not generalizing. Yeah. There's no, like, there's no, if we wanna, yeah,
There's another thing.
yeah, yeah.
Like, just like a super mechanical question, how, where do they jump into something from like bomb mulch or?
Ooh, yeah, Baumwelsch, I think.
Okay.
And the number of states is picked by like an information, like information density.
Any
Yeah.
that being other famous non-convex optimization problem, like you guess, focusing topology across.
Different seeds or yeah, I think we pretty much did. But yeah, yeah. Yeah.
So about that, is it the Markov chain on the loss curve, or is it based on?
Is it the loss curve or wait, is what based on the loss curve or based on the?
Markov?
Oh, the Markov model has no access to the loss.
Okay.
It's based only on static metrics extracted from the weights. So it's like the L2 norm of the weights. It's the, like, there is no, we're not running the model.
Yeah.
We're not backpropping.
It's like metrics, not-
Yeah. There is no forward pass. There is no backward pass. We are just computing these little summary statistics of the weights
Yep.
and fitting those.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so that's any other questions? And then I'll jump into my conclusion slide and then you can ask more questions if you want. I don't know. Everyone's, yeah?
Previous time, the one before that.
Mhm.
So is there a kind of fixed mechanism by which you could take a one that says if you need to convert it into a complex model?
Maybe. I couldn't say. I know that the things that people do to prevent or restore generalization early in training do seem to stabilize. I would say that this method is potentially useful for identifying what regularizers and what like hyperparameter selection will like stabilize things and lead to better generalization, but it's not like I don't see any like consistent universal regularizer, which would be very cool if there was a consistent universal regularizer. Everybody would be happy. Okay, so then the last thing I wanted to talk about across the board is what actually lets us understand generalization, coming back to that, right? So we can't just look at that model during inference time, the one model at the end of training, right? If we want to collect correlational evidence, we need sources of natural variation, which is probably going to be multiple runs, different seeds. A lot of papers get published where it's either one model and we say we found a good seed, you know, or it beats the state of the art. Or it's like we trained 50 models and we picked the top 3 and took their average. And those are actually like the accepted statistical practices in our field, which is really embarrassing when you talk to scientists from other fields. But, you know, if we have more random seeds, we can understand better where the variation comes in, right? And then there's developmental evidence. We need intermediate checkpoints for that. And if we want the causal developmental evidence, then we need to access the training process and be able to manipulate that. So given my micro manifesto, now oh, this is what an actual cuckoo finch looks like, by the way, not the one with the hat. Yeah. So anyone have more questions now? Okay. Why are the eggs speckled? Because it lets the prinia identify its own. Because some of them are speckled, some of them are spiraled, some of them are, have whatever weird pattern on them. And so the prinia is able to identify its own eggs because it knows it has speckles. Oh, the important thing to understand is that in continents like Europe, where you have a shorter history of brood parasitism, the victims of the European cuckoo, the hosts of the European cuckoo, tend to they'll have different patterns that are species specific, but not individually specific. So the European cuckoo has differentiated into subspecies that specialize on a particular host species. And their eggs look similar to their host species egg. And they're all the same cuckoo species. So in fact, in order to make sure that they're mating with the right cuckoo, they have imprinted on their host parent's song. So the females look for the song of their male host parent, and the males will sing the song that they learned from their male host parent. And that way they make sure that they match with the right subspecies and continue to lay, robin eggs or whatever. Yeah. Anyway. Yeah. Nature. Yeah. But it's a good fact. I love bird facts. Okay. So, yeah. Yeah, I think that something like our state model visualization could be used to improve hyperparameter tuning and stuff like that, model selection, etc. And we do see that with the MLMs, we have this evidence that allowing the easy, natural, interpretable strategy to take over is actually bad. If you let it right away learn the simple strategy, there's a simplicity bias issue, and preventing that actually improves the model. And I think that that's something that we could learn from. In the multi-basin thing, we could develop better ensembling methods. We could also potentially develop better initialization methods if we have a better idea of what the loss surface is like, and these I would say these are the general ways that we could improve things, but I'm not a person who improves things. Okay. So that's all right. Okay, so whoops.